Happy Monday, Rovers. I hope you had a great weekend and enjoyed our RT week. We're going to try another themed week again. June is Fresh Fruit and Vegetables Month, and this week is National Gardening Exercise Week. With that in mind, our whole Rovers week will be dedicated to gardening tips, cooking with fresh food, and how to get proper nutrition. We hope you love learning along with us as much as we love learning with you. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy this webinar from the United States Department of Agriculture and the Sustainable Agricultural Systems Lab on how to have great soil for your garden.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today to learn about soil health. Today we're in a real backyard garden and we're talking with soil expert and research ecologist, Dr. Stephen Mirsky. Dr. Mirsky works for ARS's Sustainable Agricultural Systems Lab out in Beltsville, Maryland, where they study molecular biology of soil and root interactions in order to produce nutrient-rich and long-lasting crops. I'm Monica Williams, and we'll be here for about 30 minutes to talk about soil health and answer your questions. To kick things off, Dr. Mirsky, what is healthy soil?
A healthy soil is a soil that is maximizing the functions that we're targeting with that soil, right? So from a garden or a farming perspective, what a healthy soil means is that it's cycling our nutrients, that it's providing good structure for the rooting of our crops, that it allows for water to infiltrate, but then it also holds on to that water. So a healthy soil is a living soil, and it's one that helps us maximize our food production systems.
Okay, we have a lot of questions already. One from Lori, and she's asking, are coffee grounds good for your soil?
Coffee grounds are just one of the many, kitchen scraps that comes out of the house that we can compost. It's not a negative at all. Many people compost their coffee grinds. I compost my coffee grinds, and I stick it in my compost. And when my compost is ready, I'll put that back into the garden, and it's a wonderful source of fertility and organic matter.
Okay, here's one from Amanda. What ways besides using compost can I improve the clay soil of my yard?
Our soils are composed of sand, silt, and clay. And, we have every possible combination of those three types, in our soil, and then some organic matter. So those are the three main soil particles, or, sand, silt, and clay. And then we have organic matter, and how they come together in the soil really affects the functionality of the soil and the performance of the soil. High clay content can create some challenges, right? If you've got a high clay content, that means it really holds on to a lot of water for a long period of time. It means when the ground is wet, you can really compact it, and it can really harden and cause, problems for root growth. It can, provide challenges for getting, seeds in the ground for planting, and it can have these really long-lasting effects. And so, there's not a lot that we can do about our soil texture. It's kind of a misnomer that we can change our soil texture, right? I mean, you'd have to make huge amendments to your soil to make significant changes to your soil texture. Now, if you're in a small garden and you have a very little area and you have a high clay content, you could certainly add a lot of organic amendments. You can add a bunch of sand, and you can offset that soil texture. But that's only something you can do really at a small scale. Once you get larger and you're in a bigger area, it's really it's not cost effective to be trying to amend your soils, your clayey soils, with sand. So the main thing we try to do is build up our organic matter. Your organic matter provides a lot of benefits to the soil, and it certainly helps make a clay soil a little bit more flexible when it comes to various different moisture conditions and compaction. So there's a lot of sources of organic amendments that you can add, whether it's compost or cover crops or straw, and all of these kinds of things can help add that organic matter to the soil.
Okay, we have a question from Alma. Does organic compost improve sand enrichment?
So as I was just mentioning about how to amend a clay soil with organic materials, the same things applies to sandy soil, right? So sandy soil is on the other side of the equation. Sand particles are really big compared to clay. I know they all look like soil and they're fine and small, and so it looks like it's all the same. But actually, sand particles are, the big differences between sand, silt, and clay is the size fraction. Sand is very big, clay is really small, and silt is in between. And so how much sand, silt, and clay you have really affects how the soil functions, right? Clay has a lot of surface area. It's really small, and so there's a lot of ability to hold on to nutrients and hold on to water. Sand is the opposite. Sand is really big, coarse fragments in the soil, particles, and so it doesn't have a high water holding capacity or a higher nutrient holding capacity. So that's why sandy soils are known to be droughty. They can get, under hot, summer days with not a lot of rain, sandy soils can dry out fast, and we can have problems with our crops. So, adding organic matter tends to provide a lot of benefit to both on the high clay side and, as importantly, on the high sand side, because sand not only is not good at creating good aggregate stability and structure because of that, big coarse particles. Clay helps. Organic matter helps with that, but then the organic matter also helps with cycling nutrients, and so it's a big way to improve your sandy soils is to add a lot of organic matter.
Great. Okay, Jeff is asking, can you explain what humic acid is and if it's a good investment for soil health, like lawns and pastures?
Humic acid is just one of the types of constituents of our organic matter. So organic matter is often called organic carbon because most of organic matter is carbon, right? And that carbon, not all carbon is created equal. Some carbon decomposes really rapidly and releases nutrients fast, and some carbon is really recalcitrant or persistent in the soil. Your humic substances or acids, they tend to be persistent in the soil, and so they represent kind of the long-term organic matter that's in the soil. And so we certainly want to try to amend that, increase that in our soil because it helps do a lot of the things I mentioned earlier about organic matter. Organic matter is just one of the great factors that builds our soil health. And so, composting is one of the ways that we do that. I know, and the more we compost, we're creating, these ephemeral, like short-lived carbon fractions. We're also creating these more long-term carbon fractions. And that's one way to add that. Another is through cover cropping. Those are kind of two key ways that you can try to increase your organic matter content and these more recalcitrant fractions. If you've got a really small garden and you can afford it, you can certainly also amend it with some of these products that are sold in your feed and fertilizer stores that will have recalcitrant fractions of organic matter that will stick around. But again, that can get costly because you need to add a lot to really make a change. If you have a small area, you can do that.
Okay, we have a question from Vance. Can you explain priming effects and their effects on soil organic matter, as well as good ways of avoiding losing soil organic matter in the deeper layers?
This priming concept is you're trying to really spark the life of the microbes. All of our soils have microbes in them. There are just tons of microbes in the soil. The types of soil we have is really what drives the types of microbes you have. If you have a very sandy soil or very clay soil, that's going to generally affect what kind of microbes you have in your soil. But whether you have a lot or little microbes in the soil, once you add organic materials, different organic substrates, you're going to prime those microbes. You're going to get them going, right? So if you really enrich it with a high pulse of organic amendments, you're going to really jack up those microbe populations, and you're going to get a lot of that cycling of nutrients. You're also going to get some good organic matter release that's going to help bind up our aggregates and soil to help stabilize the soil. So that priming effect, certainly when you're just getting going and you're kind of building up your soil, it certainly is advantageous to give it a big pulse of organic amendments because it helps get that biological activity going. But really, the sustainability of your operation is that long-term feeding of the soil. You don't want to just prime it. That's a short-term burst. What you really want to do is be continuously feeding the soil with organic amendments. Now, our topsoil, the kind of that 0 to 6 to 8 inches of the soil, that tends to be more nutrient rich. It tends to have higher organic matter content in it. Our subsoils tend to be a little bit lower in that. And it's harder to enrich our subsoils, right? If you're if you're turning your soil a lot and tilling that, that's going to break down your organic matter. And so it kind of can decrease the amount of carbon that's in the soil. But if you are tilling your soil, what you're also doing is burying some of that organic matter down to the lower subsoil. And so that's one way to kind of store carbon down in those lower subsoil to kind of help keep those layers of the soil enriched. But another great way to enrich your subsoils with carbon is to cover crop. As you can see behind me, these cover crops get pretty big, right? So as much biomass as you see above the ground is the amount of biomass that you're going to have below the ground, right? And so you're going to have that much kind of root biomass below ground, and that's going to can go down 6 to 8 feet deep into the soil quite easily.
Okay, our next question is from Violetta, and she wants to know about pH. How can I naturally balance soil pH if it's too alkaline?
Soil pH is really important, for managing your crops, right? So our soils can range between a 3 and a 10. 3 being very acidic, 10 being really alkaline, right? And so, we're trying to target to keep for most crops between about 6.5 to 7 soil pH. That's pretty neutral. It's not very acidic. It's not very alkaline. It's neutral. That's where, by and large, where most farmers are targeting. We do have some crops, for example, like blueberries that like to be a little bit more acidic. But generally, most of our crops like to be in that kind of 6.5 range. Now, if our soils are too acidic, we'll add lime, and that's one way we can bring it up to a balanced pH. Now, in this case, the question is about alkalinity. If the soil gets too alkaline, right? And so in that case, we need to be able to amend that with something like sulfur. Now, there are a number of products out there that fit under the organic standards for certification. And so if you're wanting to meet that standard, you obviously have to go to your feed and fertilizer supply store, look for a sulfur-based product that's for acidifying soil, and make sure that it says it's certified organic. But it's really important to realize that every soil responds to a sulfur or a lime addition differently. So you can't just go blindly applying these products and think you're going to get the targeted result. You really do, if you're going to make an adjustment in your pH, you need to not only get your soils measured for their pH, but there's other measurements related to the pH that gives information about how much amendment you need to have. Not all soils at a pH 6 require the same amount of amendment to get to a pH 7. And so how much you need to apply depends on your soil. So you do need to get that soil test done.
Okay, Pamela's asking, I would like to grow organic vegetables in my yard. How do I know if it's safe to plant food and have it free of lawn treatments or poisons?
When you're starting a new garden, you certainly want to know what the land use history was of that site. If you're a renter, you could try to talk to the landlord and ask, what was the previous use. If you're an owner, you're buying it, it's hard to know exactly what was done there. If it was in a lawn, you just assume that they've been managing it, with fertilizers and other kind of weed and insect control inputs over the years. If it's just a lot that has been recently established, you don't exactly know what you're working with because it's a construction site that could be, some kind of consolidated soil, materials that either have been brought in or that they've kind of, moved a lot of things around. So it's hard to exactly know. But generally, most of the kind of residual chemistries that you might be concerned about that are inputs from, homeowners, most of those don't persist for long periods of time, right? I mean, usually 1 to 2 years at most. Some of our really persistent weed control strategies like controlling poison ivy, some of those herbicides can stick around in the soil for 18 months or so. But this also depends on how heavy the rain is in your region. If you're a really dry locations or if you're really wet, wetter sites tend to decompose and leave the systems faster. But generally, if you're going to start a new garden, what I'd recommend is, it's nice if you can have a year of cover cropping. So set up your garden, plant it to some, cereal rye or hairy vetch or crimson clover, or peas, brassicas, whatever. Grow it for a season. By that next year, most of your concerns are going to be not really problematic. And if you see a response, you'll see it in the cover crop. So that cover crop will give you indication if there's something to be concerned about. On the other hand, if you've got heavy metals in those soils, that's certainly something you could be measuring, and you know, you have to go get a soil test done to be able to determine if there's a concern.
Great. Okay, here's one from Jeff in Denver, Colorado. Soil in Colorado has so much clay, which makes it difficult to grow vegetables. What can I do to beef up my soil?
That's a good question, Jeff. You know, it can be a real challenge, you know, in these heavy clay soils, you know, because heavy clay soils are very finicky, right? You can't get in the ground, you can't get in there and work the ground very quickly, because when they're wet, it can cause a lot of damage and compaction and problems. You can ruin a lot of that aeration. You know, we need air in our soils, surprisingly. So it's important to have that air in there. And you know, working wet clay grounds can get a lot of that out of there, plus compaction and other problems. So, you know, there's a couple of different strategies that you have to take when you're working with a heavier soil. You know, my soil here, it's not really heavy clay, but it's definitely on the clay side, right? I'm not a sandy soil. And so I've made raised beds. You know, making these raised beds helps the ground drain out faster, so that I can get more workable days. I've also tried to manage my organic matter content. I use a lot of compost and cover crops and animal waste to help build up the soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is a way to kind of mitigate some of those challenging issues with our clay soils, makes it a little bit more flexible. But then the other thing is, you know, you just got to be really cognizant of the fact that you've got a more temperamental soil. So you've got to be able to create some flexibility for yourself. So one of the little tricks I do, you know, it's a little bit of a pain, but it works out pretty nicely for us, especially in the spring when it's pretty wet outside and the ground is going to take forever to dry because it's not hot and there's a lot of rain in the spring. I sometimes put a little plastic sheet down in my spring garden areas. You know, I don't plant huge spring gardens, so it's not a big amount of plastic, but I can cover a little area when a couple of rains are going to come. Because sometimes all you need to do is tie together a couple of rain events, right? So if you've got like a couple of dry days, then you got a rain, a couple of dry days and a rain. If I can cover that ground during those 2 rain events, it's usually enough to let it dry out. And then I can get in there and work that ground. That gives me a little bit of flexibility. So that sounds a little crazy, but sometimes those are the things we got to do on a small garden.
Can you show us what you're growing in your garden?
Sure. You know, right now it's early May in Maryland. So early May in Maryland means a spring garden. We've gotten a fair bit of stuff in this year. You know, it's due to the pandemic, we've been home a bit more, so we've been able to kind of get a little bit more stuff in. But you know, we've got, you know, parsley and cabbage and cauliflower and kale, mustard's growing. I say lettuce. Some potatoes down there we've got planted. We didn't get the peas in this year. I was hoping to get some peas in, but didn't get to that. So a lot of your spring crops.
What can I do to improve my soil health or the nutrients in my soil?
You know, when we're thinking about soil health, it's important to understand that, you know, everybody's on their own trajectory, right? You know, every soil has its own potential. And so you don't want to be comparing yourself to your neighbor. You don't want to be comparing yourself to your aunt who lives, you know, a couple states away. Your soil health and the ability to improve that soil health really pertains to you and your site and your garden or your farm or such, right? Because every soil has a different potential. So within that, you know, how do you manage for soil health? How do you build your soil health? I mean, 2 of the biggest critical strategies that are being advocated right now to build soil health is reduced tillage and plant cover crops, right? Those are key practices that build soil health, right? Because, you know, we want to reduce our erosion, we want to build our soil organic matter content, have, you know, stable aggregates in the soil that are kind of holding the soil together, having good structure to allow for root growth. We want this active cycling of nutrients in the ground by the microbes, and we want to have good water infiltration and storage. So these are all the kinds of things that we use to characterize a healthy soil. What gets us there? You know, again, reducing tillage. The frequency of tillage is certainly great. That helps with that. You know, home gardens, it's harder to do that because you kind of have to work up all that residues, and you don't have a lot of equipment that can work with, you know, penetrating, you know, no-till ground and putting seeds in the ground, so it's a little bit harder. You certainly can use transplants, like here, for example. This is something I grow my own transplants, right? And so, I'll no-till this bed behind me. This is where a cover crop is growing. So I'll come in, I'll knock this cover crop down, and then I'll just make a hole in the ground and put this transplant in. So that's kind of no-till, backyard gardening, right? I'm using the cover crop as my mulch. It's helping to protect the soil and build the soil. And then I don't till it, and then I can put this in here in the ground in that mulch. But so cover crops and no-till are a big part of that. But in general, a healthy soil is a soil that you keep feeding. We want to try to have roots growing all the time. So the more kind of things that you got growing in there and between your crops, like cover crops, or adding organic amendments, all helps kind of build up that soil and make it healthy.
How do I know if I'm getting too much rainwater from my soil? What should I do about it? And is there an ideal amount of sun that I should get in my garden?
Well, climate is hard to manage, right? You get what you get. Depending on where you are in the country, you're going to have a lot of rain or a little bit. In our region here, we can get easily over 40 inches of rain per year. And that's quite a bit compared to some regions of the country that are only getting 10 to 12 inches. But how much rain you get per year is not as important about when you get the rain, right? I mean, just in the last 5 years, I've had some of the wettest years in recorded history and some of the driest years in recorded history. So it's hard to manage for that. But generally, the kinds of things that you want to keep into mind is what your soil is, right? So if you've got a heavy soil with a lot of clay in it, and you're getting a lot of rain, then you're going to have a lot of challenges with having that soil dry out. So what I do to help with my soil dry out, because I tend to have a higher clay content, and I live in a region with a very high rainfall, is I use raised beds. So these vegetable beds here that you see here, you can see that the bed where the crops are planted is good 8 to 9 inches above the alleyway where I come in and walk and move different equipment in my tractor. So that raised bed helps the ground dry out a little bit. If I had a very sandy soil, I wouldn't worry so much about that. Even if I got a lot of rain, probably be less of a concern. It's good to notice where the drainage is on the property. If you're in a really low area, that's a problem. So like I have a slope in my garden. So down the hill there, that area gets really wet. So I know that area stays wet. So sometimes I plant crops down there that I know are like a little bit of a wetter soil, or I put in more perennial crops that can handle those wetter soils and I don't have to do a lot of tillage. So knowing where your wet parts of your fields are or dry parts matter. If you've got really wet ground a lot, you can also be using cover crops that can help dry out those ground in the springtime, so that once you kill that cover crop, you've reduced some of that water in the soil, make it a little bit more workable. But by and large, the soil you have and the rainfall you have is the situation you're in, and you don't have a lot of flexibility. So you can create some ways to kind of mitigate that by trying to cover your ground if it's a small little area on a big heavy rain, so that you can get into the field sooner. But generally, you're going to have to be patient with what you have. As far as sunlight, you want to try to have your garden in the sunniest parts of your field as possible, right? The areas that get the most sun is going to be best for most crops. Most crops prefer a high sun environment. If you have a very low sun environment, then that might limit what kinds of vegetables you can grow. You might have to just focus on the more shade tolerant species that do better in these less sunny environments. But there's a lot of crops that they just produce less food, right? So you just get less tomatoes or less peppers, and you just that's what you're going to be able to grow at that site. So you kind of have to work with what you got.
Okay, so what about going organic? Are there sorts of amendments and fertilizers that are more soil friendly?
If you're going to go organic, then you have to pay attention to what the organic standards are, right? I mean, there's a whole standards out there of how you have to abide by to meet, what those organic rules are, and they generally mean, no, synthetic fertilizers and no herbicides and insecticides, various different pesticides, unless they've been certified organic. There are products out there that are both sources of fertility and pest management that have been certified for organic and approved, and so you can use those. For at my homestead, what our organic sources of fertility, which are the primary sources of organic fertility that folks target. Cover crops, first and foremost, they help build the soil and add fertility. There's animal waste. I have chickens in my operation, so I have the chickens live right on the garden beds, and they go into the bathroom right on top of that soil over the course of a year, and that helps build up the soil. But if you don't have animals, you certainly can import, horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure. All these are good sources of organic fertility. And then the soil itself is a source of fertility, right? If you're building up your soil over time and you're amending it with composts and manures and such, you tend to build up your soil organic matter content to the point where it's releasing nutrients on an annual basis. And generally in our small gardens, we do so much amending of organic materials and manures and these types of products that we tend to have a high fertility. And so you can count on a fair bit of fertility just from the cycling of nutrients of the soil alone in your organic systems.
So we have time for one more question. I've heard that rotating crops improves soil fertility. My backyard garden isn't huge, so does it really matter?
This is a great question. I appreciate it. It's, I certainly want to lead by saying that crop rotation is single-handedly one of the most important sustainable agricultural strategies that we can use. It does so much for our systems. From diversifying the crops that grow means you're changing the phenology of the crops. Like if you're planting a crop that's a grass or a crop that's a broadleaf, or crops that are perennials. When you're rotating your crops around, you're breaking up pest cycles. You're helping to build up that soil. You're creating a lot of resilience in the system that you can't do any other way. So I'm a huge advocate for crop rotation, but in a small backyard garden, that's really hard to do. So what I try to do, even on my property, is at least rotate spatially where I have crops. Even in my big garden here, I can't take land out of production. I want to keep everything cropped, from my spring crops to my summer crops to my fall crops. I'm always kind of planting different things. I can't just take something out of production and put it in the cover crop, right? So I try to spatially separate out some of these crops, like wherever I had a tomato or a pepper plant, things that I know that can build up certain types of disease and insect pressure. I'll try to put them as far apart from where I had them last year as possible. I can do a little bit more of that because I got a pretty big spread here. But if you're in a small backyard garden, you really just don't have an option. I mean, what are you going to do? Put your tomato plant 5 foot to 10 foot over to the left of the box? You don't have a lot of flexibility. So you can try to do some of that because, some spatial separation does make a difference. But, for the small gardener, you're just going to have to be more attentive to the insect, disease, and weed problems that can come on that crop rotation can help you with, but you just don't have that flexibility. So don't get yourself too worried about it. A lot of people are in that same situation, and you work with what you got, and you just have to kind of pay close attention to when you got some pest problems coming on.
Dr. Mirsky, thank you so much for showing us your garden today and talking to us about how to care for our soil. And thank all of you for joining us and sending your questions in. We have more tips on healthy soil in your backyard garden on our website, so make sure you check it out at www.ars.usda.gov. And any questions that we didn't address today, we'll make sure we have them on the website. Thanks for joining us.